Good morning. This is Martha Ambrose. I'm the Executive Director of CalISBOA, and we have been working this week with Jaffe Emergency Services, trying to get a handle on what's going on with the COVID-19 virus, and we know that all of you have been in communication with a number of resources, and we thought it was a good idea to follow the model that we've had with wildfires and try and put together some resources in the form of a webinar and share some information to use your time wisely and give you whatever updates we have. Also on the call is another resource for independent schools, Tom Wildman, who is the founder and principal of Knowing Technologies, and he works with a lot of independent schools, has been fielding a lot of questions this week. So he's very aware of kind of what's top of mind with our schools. So, and then one other update on a resource that I've been asked a lot about. I was in touch with Liebert Cassidy Whitmore yesterday. Their partner, Linda Adler, is the point person for the coronavirus questions. And she told me that they are putting together a Q&A bulletin that should go out today. I'm sure that they will send it to anybody who's on their list. And we will also post it to our listserv and put it on our website, which has a list of other resources and links. And you can access our list via the link on the home page. With that, I am going to turn this over to Chris Jaffe.
Awesome. Thanks, Martha, and good morning, everyone. Before we actually jump in and get started on our content, I have a couple of quick things I want to do with everyone. And the first is, this is just a reminder of how to breathe. A lot of the response in this particular incident has been sort of fear-based and fear-driven, and that's fairly common in emergencies. But I want to remind everybody that right now we're at a point where we've got a serious situation that we need to prepare for, but it is not the time to panic, and it's not the time to stop breathing and to freak out, for lack of a better way to put it. It really is a time to sort of think diligently and deliberately about what we're doing, how we're keeping students safe, how we're keeping our schools safe as a whole, and what we can do to be more prepared. We're going to talk today about a couple of things, in particular, sort of a quick update on where we are, specifically in California. We're going to talk a little bit about travel, a little bit about remote learning, and then sort of business continuity and where we go from here. And throughout all of this, we're going to talk about some process that hopefully you have in place, and there's absolutely still an opportunity to put some pieces together of your own puzzle as we work toward ensuring that everybody can be safe. The other thing I wanted to do is I'm going to share a spreadsheet with you all in the chat panel. So on the right-hand side of your screen, we're going to drop this link in. Like we've done with the fires and with other events that we've sort of tackled together, to really just think about what individual schools are doing. And you'll notice on the spreadsheet, there are actually two different tabs. So on the first tab, it's about closures and trip cancellations. And then on the second tab, it's remote learning and some ideas that may work for different age groups. And so I want to encourage you to take a moment or two to update us on where you currently are, and also update one another. I think in a lot of ways, this is one of the most valuable parts of these conversations, is getting a chance to see where other folks are. And then finally, on the list of sort of kickoff items, there's also a question panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Many of you have actually already jumped in with questions, and thank you for that. I'll answer a couple of those logistics in just a moment. But also, as we go through our conversation today, please, please, please ask questions in that panel. We want to make sure that this is not just sort of a synthesis of all the resources that are out there, but really it's an opportunity to help make sure that you know the answers to your questions. And so please, please continue to ask those questions. A couple of logistics that have come in so far. David asked about the PowerPoint. We absolutely will share the link to the PowerPoint deck And Deanne asked about whether this session is being recorded, and it is being recorded, and we'll absolutely share a copy of the recording with you. It may take us an hour or two to get it out, but it will be out today. And so with that, I think we'll dive in. Again, to add a little bit of levity to the situation, a couple comics. You're more than welcome to use these. The reality is there's a lot of news and a lot of sort of coverage, and I think that's causing extra angst and extra concern within every community. And so I want to remind everyone to stay focused on the resources that exist and be thoughtful about the communications that we're sending out and making sure that we're sending out messaging at a pace that's appropriate for the situation that we're dealing with. This is another picture. We used this in a call earlier in the week, sort of referencing the idea that we're dealing with a situation where we don't want to overreact. We definitely don't want to underreact. And for some of us, we have to kind of vacillate between the two before we figure out what is just right. And hopefully we'll be able to create some clarity on that for everyone on this call as well. So having said all of that, a quick sort of overview of what we're dealing with. Coronavirus is, a lot of you have seen the news coverage and have seen some of these facts, maybe all of these facts. But one of the big and key items that we wanted to share with you is that it's most impactful for people who are over 51 years old. So as we think about coronavirus from a student safety perspective, absolutely students can be carriers, students can get it. It can be challenging, but students are not those that are going to be at highest risk for severe consequences from contracting the virus if they do. Again, not to say that we don't need to continue to be focused and diligent and mindful about how we're treating students and keeping school safe, but I do want to set some context for everyone. The other big sort of misnomer that we want to correct is that airborne spread is not believed currently to be the driver of transmission. So put differently, if somebody's coughing or somebody is sneezing or people are in a space near somebody who has coronavirus right now, we don't think that that is a trigger for the virus spreading. We think it's based on touch. And so droplets that are on an elevator button, droplets that are on a doorknob, droplets that are on a table, on a computer, things like that. We think you have to touch something in order to actually pick up the virus, and in fact, you have to touch something and then touch your face, or touch something and then touch a cut, or somehow sort of get it into your body. And so again, I sort of share that as context as we talk about and think about how we're keeping students safe, as we talk about quarantine spaces, things like that. It's important to know what the spread actually looks and feels like. Other sort of high-level context that we want to share, as far as symptoms are concerned, we're looking at a dry cough and a fever. That's a really important part of this. And overall, just being really, really tired. We're looking at doing everything that we can to prevent it by limiting the amount, and I apologize, of course, there's some outdoor noise right now. We're looking at trying to do as much as we can to minimize physical contact. And so one of the things that's come up for a lot of our schools is this conversation about ensuring that when we do have group events, that we minimize handshaking, we minimize hugs, we minimize all of the physical contact that we possibly can, and in turn, try to use things like a fist bump or an elbow bump, or the NBA is doing that foot tap thing that hopefully you've seen. I tried to demonstrate earlier in the week and I almost fell over. So we're trying to do everything that we can to reduce the amount of physical contact that takes place both on campus and at events. There are a couple key resources that we want to encourage everybody to keep checking. The first is the CDC. The CDC has put together some really good resources on large gatherings and for schools. These links are active, so when you have access to this deck, you'll be able to reference the link specifically. The other group is the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization is updating this page of situation reports every single day. And the benefit to these situation reports is that we can actually see in these reports the number of cases that exist per country and the number of new cases that have popped up. And so you can make really thoughtful and correct decisions about where we're going, what our risk factors are, and be mindful and, again, deliberate about those decisions. I call that out because a lot of the conversation that we've been having is related to travel and this idea of, are we going to go on our spring break trips? Are we going to go on our summer trips? Are we sending staff and faculty to conferences? All of those types of questions. And right now, there's no specific guidance that's in place that is encouraging anybody to limit travel within the United States. It's not to say that it won't change. It's not to say that it won't appear later on. But right now, there's no specific guidance from the CDC, the World Health Organization, or anyone else that's limiting in US travel. There is currently some type of recommendation against travel to the countries that are on the screen: Iran, China, South Korea, Japan. And the CDC has a list on their website that'll be in the resource packet that we share out. And I would encourage you to be sort of thoughtful about checking that list regularly. It will absolutely evolve over the next couple of weeks and months. Having said that, I also want to call out the fact that individual schools get to make your own decisions. And so if you're looking at a trip that's coming up, either a spring break trip or an end of year trip, or maybe even a summer trip that's going somewhere in the United States or going to another country, you absolutely have the option and the ability to choose to cancel that trip, to change that trip, to defer that trip. And so we would encourage you to make a decision that feels right for your community. When I say that, what I'm really talking about here is making sure that you're sort of working with and listening to your families about what their level of concern is. There's been a lot of conversation around sort of repeating and reminding parents about what the risks are of travel, and specifically, of course, right now. And as we do that, I would encourage you to be sort of watching for and listening for what parents' responses are. A handful of schools have canceled trips and had some really disappointed parents. A handful of schools haven't canceled and had very disappointed parents. But I think if you start with a conversation and are mindful and thoughtful about what the trip is, the purpose of the trip itself, and also the risks and the benefits of going forward with the trip, you can get a lot from parents about whether or not they would like to go forward with that decision. And then last but not least on the travel front, for those of you that have pre-existing trips that are already scheduled, probably the first and most important thing that you can check is your contract. We've been talking about force majeure clauses in contracts more in the last 2 weeks than we ever have in the entire existence of our organization. And for those that are not familiar with those clauses, most of your contracts should have something in them that says that the contract is eligible to be canceled based on anything that's outside of your or the vendor's control. And so things like pandemics do fall into that category in most cases, and I would encourage you to double check your cancellation policies and also double check the timing that's associated with them. For some schools, cancellation policies are 30 days out, 60 days out, sometimes they're 24 hours. Just know what is in your contracts, because you may have to make a decision to sort of operate outside of what's in the contract, but you want to obviously know that before making that decision. And then, like with everything else, I would really encourage you to think about what is the purpose of the trip? Why are we going to XYZ location? What's the benefit? We've gotten a lot of questions about going to amusement parks, to places like Disneyland, etc. What's the purpose? We're obviously not going to be able to control an environment like that as well as we can control the environment on campus, but is it worth that risk? And are we willing to take that risk, and are our parents willing to take that risk? And those are all questions that you can and should ask, and they'll be different for each and every community. As you're thinking about where you're going, I mentioned earlier the situation report on the World Health Organization's website. One of the benefits to using that is when you look at that list and you can see the number of cases that have been reported in any given country, you can see the number of new cases that have been reported, you can make a really objective and deliberate decision about when you're traveling, where you're traveling, and where you're not traveling. I would encourage you to be consistent about what your criteria are. And so if you're using that report and you're saying if there are more than X number of cases, or if there's a greater than X percentage of that population that's been impacted, then we're not going to go. That gives you a lot more sort of leverage from both, I think, a legal perspective, but absolutely from a PR and communications perspective. Again, some of the conversation that we've had around folks that are coming into our community, so traveling to the US, traveling to California to visit schools, has been based around avoiding discrimination. And that's obviously also really important. And I would encourage you to use that same sort of thought process when it comes to where we are going as well.
Chris,
I'm gonna pause here. Oh, go ahead, Martha.
I had a long discussion with Linda Adler about travel, and there will be a lot in that bulletin, but Chris is absolutely right. There has to be a consistency, and the more you can base your decision-making on objective criteria, and now's the time to be determining what that criteria is. Use the CDC, use your local health departments, and you know, if you're having the trip and someone is really uncomfortable with going, maybe you should just allow them to do that. They may, again, whether they get their money back or not, that's something totally different. But you want to make sure that what you're doing is consistent with your policies, and that your policies are applied consistently and calmly. And if you can, before there's an issue, let families know how you're going to be looking at this, and communicate it in a very, calm way, that's the best way to do it. And, again, we're a community, we make these decisions, we're very thoughtful, we know what's going on, here's the criteria, this is where we are.
Thanks, Martha. I'm going to take a quick look. There are a bunch of questions that have come in, and so I want to just answer some of those that are in line with this particular conversation. The first is from, let's see, I'm going to go backwards, from Kathleen. So we have events coming up, open houses, family events, science fairs. What is a large event? And as we're looking at mass gatherings, essentially, how do we make the decision around whether they're too big and whether they should be canceled? I think a lot of us are asking that same question, and certainly, there's been a lot of coverage around sporting events and other sort of really big mass gatherings, conferences, events, what have you. What I would encourage you to do is to, again, kind of think about why. What's the purpose of the event? How important is it to your school, to the year, to where things are? If it can be canceled, if it's not so significant that you can't imagine living without it, then great, go ahead and cancel it. If it can't, if you feel like it's a critical event, it's an open house and leads to admissions and things like that, then right now, up to a few hundred people on campus is not the end of the world. I would start each event with a conversation, and it can be in whatever tone fits your community. It may be a light, tone of levity, might be a really serious remark, doesn't matter. But I would start the event with a conversation about limiting contact. And so again, avoiding those hugs and handshakes and all the contact that often goes along with those types of events. And encourage the fist bump or the elbow bumps or the NBA foot bumps, whatever it is that works, as our form of sort of connecting with one another. Beyond that, cleaning is obviously really important before, during, and after those events. And the goal is not to do anything fundamentally different than what you typically do, but wiping down surfaces that people are touching throughout that event. And again, it's the elevator button, the push button on the door, or push bar on the door, things like that everybody's touching as they come through a space that we would want to be clean. Great question, Kathleen. Let's see, Elena, this is a good question. It steps a little bit too far into the legal side, so I'm going to add that to the list of questions that we'll share with LCW and see if they can answer it. The question is around responsibility as an employer if an employee is traveling to countries that are or are not on the CDC list. What I will say is a lot of the questions that have come up around people who have traveled back from countries that are on the CDC lists have been around quarantine. I want to take just a second here to talk a little bit about that, as well as there are a couple questions around what happens if there's an emergency on the trip. First, if an emergency takes place on the trip, it's going to be treated the same as it would be independent of the coronavirus. And so if it's a medical emergency, it'll be treated at the local hospital, and then you would do what you would do anyway to get that student back to the US, whether quarantine was or wasn't necessary. That said, when we get into the quarantine space, folks have asked, if we have a spouse that's quarantined, if we have another child in the family that's quarantined, does the entire family need to stay in quarantine, or are they able to, can the rest of the family come to school, go to work, be out in the community? And typically the public health department, when they come in and work with an individual on quarantine, will actually quarantine that person in a specific space in the house. And again, the significance of this not being airborne, but instead being a contact-related virus is it is okay for somebody to be quarantined in a specific room or specific space in their home, and for other members of the family to continue to join the community events, to be out in the community, et cetera. I would have a conversation with the folks that are impacted, and that's, it's a direct and frank conversation about what the expectations are and what the public health department has said. And then I would also have a direct conversation with the public health department to verify that. But I would say 9 times out of 10, that's what we've seen so far. There are, let's see, from Scott. This is a great question. Scott, what types of policies and restrictions should we put in place for families that go on spring break and then return back to school? For families that travel to a country that's on the CDC list and then come back, do they need to quarantine themselves for 14 days before returning to school? It's a great question. And I think spring break obviously being the closest sort of opportunity for travel, that's probably where most of the travel related questions are going to be from. I do want to flag related to that if you're talking or thinking about summer travel, we're probably a little bit too early to make those final decisions, but spring break, we're probably right on par. For folks that are coming back from a country that's on the CDC's list, the public health department will set a specific or has set specific guidelines for them, and will be enforcing those with them upon return to the country. And so if you're starting to think about what happens when somebody returns from China or Iran or any of the other countries that are on that list, the public health department has already created those expectations for them. And I'll include those in our follow-up to this webinar. So I'm just going to jot that down.
And Chris, I want to chime in here a little bit on this. Consistency. Libercasti is going to address this topic, and this could also apply to employees, which also would have some different restrictions. But it's consistency. So if you're saying, anybody that's on the CDC level 2 or level 3, that's across the board. And you would just have to be very consistent in your communication, make sure people understand it before spring break, and make sure they understand that if it's not a level 2 when they go, but it's a level 2 when they get back, it's just very consistent with something that is an objective source like the CDC, so that everybody understands where that's coming from, and communicate what kind of accommodations you're going to make for the student. So, each situation may have some nuances of its own, and so just again, and particularly with employees, that's a really hard one to get into on a call like this, but that's the guidance.
Well said. Consistency, consistency, consistency. I'm going to jump next into communication. I'm seeing some questions coming up around sort of how and when to communicate. And one of the things that we're finding is more and more schools are sending out at least a proactive message. And so for those who have already done that, kudos to you for doing so. For those who haven't, it's definitely not a bad idea to send out a proactive, we are aware of the situation, we're doing what we can. And in some cases, you may go so far as to include some specific language around what you're doing to keep campus clean. Again, each community is a little bit different culturally. Some communities feel really good about that and feel like it's necessary. Others feel like it's absolutely not customary in their community to have that level of detail. So again, totally community specific, but a communication of some sort at this point is probably a good idea. And I would go so far as to say we're to the point where you can start to build a rhythm. For faculty and staff, it's probably about a weekly message, if not a more frequent one. We do have some schools, especially in Washington and some other areas where there's a greater level of perceived risk, where they're actually doing daily emails. And they're fairly brief, but a daily summary of sort of where things are and what's happening. The intent with the communication, especially to faculty and staff, is to keep people calm and to ensure that because this is a situation that's developing hourly, and every other time you pick up your phone, you see something different, there's another news story, there's another concern, a closure, an incident. We're trying to use these communications to help temper people's sort of feelings of angst and feelings of anxiety, and remind them what we're doing, what they can be doing to keep themselves and the rest of the community safe. For parents, the board, for others, I would say probably weekly at this point. And again, for each community, that's going to be different. It's our goal to send out a summary of sort toward the end of the week in preparation for the following week. So we're also working on our routine right now, and that may shift. But I would say roughly weekly, a general update to keep folks posted. And then I wanted to go so far as to include the casual labor group on here. Many of our schools have done a really good job at communicating to parents and faculty and staff, and then have sort of neglected to communicate and work with casual labor folks. And so security, facilities, in some cases, bus drivers, tutors, behaviorists, any of those people who are not sort of directly within your community, I would encourage you to have an ongoing conversation with them about weekly as well, because there are impacts both to their teams and workforces as that you may need to be aware of. And of course, in any of those cases, there's some form of partnership in place. And so making sure that we have that communication in place would be really valuable. And certainly there's an opportunity to get ahead of that at this point. The next place that we'll go is this conversation around closure. And I want to be transparent to say that, I think definitely a possibility of closure and of moving to a position where, because of risk of contracting illness, that we have to close schools or workplaces, et cetera. It's possible. We're not there yet, and we're frankly a ways away from it. And it's very, very likely that we won't get to that point. But in the event that we did, it is absolutely worth having a plan, or at least having a framework for which or from which we can operate. And so we typically break this into people, place, and program. I'm going to start with some sort of general place and program work, and then I'll turn it over to Tom to talk a little bit more about the educational side. On the front end of this, what a timeline to sort of be mindful of, or to have in the back of your mind at least, is that once we move into closure, we have about 7 days to resume some form of operations, some form of ideally education, before we start to lose members of the community and before we start to have a real challenge keeping folks connected. So it's not to say that you have to take 7 days, and by all means, if you could resume some form of education the next day, that's great. But it is to say that that's sort of the maximum amount of time that you have to get a plan in place and then execute on it. Having said that, what does it look like? If we're in a position where we're in a closure, what one option may be to have folks come together in relatively small groups. And so like 3 to 5 is probably the number. And again, if and when we reach this point, that number will be released by the public health department. And it's going to be different per community. So it may be that in LA County, there's one expectation, and in Orange County, there's another. It could even be so small as to say, like in Oakland, there's one expectation, and in San Francisco, there's another. So it's not necessarily, it really is sort of customized on a per community basis. But there's absolutely a possibility that we could get together in relatively small groups, and the intent would be to try to keep those fairly consistent. If we can't, then there's a good opportunity to, at the very least, have some form of digital education in place. And depending on age group, depending on your community, that may look different and may, in fact, shift and change over time. I think the push I want to offer you up front is to think a little bit about the core leadership team, your command center group. And so in most cases, that's your head of school, it's your CFO, your facilities director, probably your IT team, your tech team of some sort, your counselor, and then possibly your health office or your nurse. That core group of people should be coming together at this point at least once a week, if not more frequently, to talk through and to put together this plan. And then in the event that we needed to execute it, that team probably is coming together at least a couple times a day to check and make sure that it's actually working. I say that because depending on the length of time that we move in, that we have to deal with the closure for, we may have any number of different layers to the education that's taking place. And what I mean by that is we may have a flip the classroom model where students are doing work sort of asynchronously and then coming together to troubleshoot homework and difficult parts of or challenges that they're working through. We may have synchronous programs where everybody is coming together through a platform like Google Hangouts, and they're working together from home or from a coffee shop or from another location. And we may have some combination of those. And it's really, really critical to make sure that as we're sort of building this, that we're also testing and looking at the community to see what is and what isn't working. For those that aren't familiar with that command center model, a quick chart here. I would say if you don't have this in place already, now's probably not the time to build it. Work with what you've got. The same is true for your business continuity as a whole. If you don't already have a business continuity plan in place, now is not the time to put together a soup to nuts plan, but instead a time to say, okay, what are the things that we absolutely must make sure that we keep doing? Tom, do you want me to turn it over to you here to talk a little bit about the academic side?
Yeah, I'm reading this slide. I think probably this is a good overlap point too. I'm going to talk a little bit about these things. So sure. Let me know if you can hear me, Chris.
Yep, I've got you.
All right. Okay, let me know when I'm the presenter and I'll share my screen here.
All right. Let's see. It should be ready for you. Oh, nope. There we go. All right, that should be ready for you.
All right, great. Okay, hello everyone. So I'm going to cover these things. I want to give a little bit of background into why these things are on our slide. We've been spending the past a little bit more than a week now preparing our client schools, business office, HR leadership team, instructional leaders, and technology planners as they prepare for whatever impact the threat of this virus is going to make on the school. So I'll be talking from the position of having worked through many of these things with our schools. Also, at the very end, optionally, depending on time, I can tell you what we have provided to our personnel for their conduct and safety when they're on campus. And then I've also given the same information to heads of schools and technology leaders at schools as they want to know how should their technology offices be running. So with that, let me just get into this. Chris, also, if there are questions, do you mind just interrupting me with ones that you want me to answer, because I don't see anything scrolling through here.
Absolutely.
Great. Okay. So first, let's talk about the scenarios that you should prepare for. This is just kind of a way to think about how this is going to unfold. We're currently likely in the upper left, where all students and educators are present and are able to make it to school. But we'll be working through, and in this case, you have the opportunity to create plans and prepare. But we'll be working down to the lower right corner when schools are closed, students and faculty and staff are staying home. And any combination between there is where you're going to be thinking about how your plan is going to react. And as Chris said, at the end of this, within a short period of time, we'll make these slides available. This, of course, is not a plan, but it's how you can imagine your plan is going to have to address a variety of situations. These are things that we've told our business offices to prepare for, that mail-in deliveries are stopped, and unfortunately it's enrollment season, so that could mean enrollment agreements are delayed, checks are delayed. You may have pledges and gifts that come in that you're required to process, and then bills for critical systems that you want to make sure stay up. And I'll talk about these in a second, but we're also next month going to start looking at employment agreements at independent schools. So just consider that some of these things processing some of these may be impeded by how you are choosing to respond to the emergency. So when students and teachers stay home, you have to understand what's required for accreditation, how are you going to track attendance, what are the requirements that your school has for continuing teaching. Of course, you're going to have a remote learning plan in place if the closure lasts more than just a couple of days. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the end as well. Chris was also talking about the need for plans. It's planning, it's planning, it's planning. And, since you're all schools that are pre-K through 12, many of your students may not have access to email. So how are you going to stay in touch with students? You really can't lose touch with the students that are receiving the education, because even though you're doing remote learning, you're still responsible for making sure that students attend whatever is being provided for lessons. So understand in your planning what the responsibilities of both students and teachers is going to be. When do they check in? What do they report up? How do they report attendance? How do they report participation? How are you going to be doing grading in a new model of delivery delivering instruction? And then you'll have to have some communication. I'll talk about that again a little bit later. You'll have to have some communication about expectations of what happens at home. A student that is at home in a well-wired and connected environment has a very different experience and set of challenges than a student that may not have internet or may not have a device that they can use to access instruction. So think about equality and access when you're developing the plans. I talked to one school that has a stack of Chromebooks that they're making available to anyone in the community that needs access to one during a school closure, if it comes to that. Now, as far as internet access, that's a little bit tougher problem to solve ad hoc. So we talked, Chris mentioned this concept of triggering events and in your plans. And by the way, I've talked to schools that really haven't developed much of a plan and some that have a fairly well-developed plan. You're thinking about, well, what are the triggering events that cause us to act on the plan? And so, of course, they go from the least severe to the most severe. From students and teachers are voluntarily staying home, which is already happening at some schools because either they have some other condition and a compromised immune system, or perhaps they've come in contact with somebody or someone who's passed through their home who has been to China, and so out of a cautionary measure, They may be volunteering to stay at home. So how are you going to react to that? Is the student absent? What if it's a teacher? Is there a backup? Is there a substitute? Are there lessons ready for them to deliver? And then the severity of the triggering events goes all the way down to there's a community spread that's been identified within your school, which means no one can come together in that school until it's been able to get under control. So again, I'll make these slides available, but you can be thinking about the kinds of triggering events. This is certainly not a decisive list. It's just a consideration of an increasing severity that you may consider, any one of which could be an event that triggers a new part of your plan. I've seen some plans that are just 2 or 3 points, like level 1, we have some available substitutions, all the way down to level 3 where we're shut down and everything is remote. So let's talk a little bit about technology considerations. And Chris, if this is too tangential to the intended direction, just let me know and I'll move on to the next selection. So really, you have to be able to continue to operate the school when the school is closed or partially closed. And these are the things to consider about the situations under which you'll have to continue to operate while you or leaders are off campus. They could be either off campus in their normal homes, or they could be dispersed to different locations. Any key leader, like Chris showed the command hierarchy, the command structure, you should plan for any key member of that to be sick, and not just in the response command structure, but also in your operational structure. For example, it's going to be critical that you continue to pay bills, essential that you continue to pay payroll and benefits. Are 2 people prepared to do that? If not, part of your immediate planning should be preparing a second person. I think I saw Chris mention maybe even a third. What if 2 of those people are sick? There's some roles that are essential to keep the school operating, and the business office has many of them. So we've also talked to schools about having to implement temporary policies like sick time. Even if the illness is not related to COVID-19, what you want to encourage is employees that are feeling ill, employees, students that are feeling ill to not come in. Is particularly impactful to employees, and even more particularly impactful to the non-exempt employees, to make sure that they're clear on what your policy is to cover sick time in the event that they've run out of it. We got a message from one school that said, all right, during the time that the virus is a threat, they're suspending sick time limits. So if they allowed 10 sick days per year, employees can now stay home an unlimited amount of time if they're ill without penalty of payment. So just consider that there are some temporary policies that you may have to make. How are you going to operate with no mail or deliveries? Maybe there's a period of time where mail can be delivered, but it can be forwarded to a business officer's home. And maybe you are able to return to campus within a couple weeks, and maybe it's going to take months for you to be able to return to campus and reassemble. So, and we are telling our employees that they should be prepared with 2 weeks of food at home in case they're self-quarantine the household. We have 4 different slide decks, and I've assembled a lot of them into this, so it may look like there's a little bit of a mishmash, but I'm trying to address a bit of a broader audience here. Here are some technology procedures to consider. There are some things you absolutely cannot suspend, and sometimes when there's an emergency, we start to throw process out the window first. Well, don't do that. Make sure that you're still managing data safely. You continue backups both on and off campus. Maybe in the process of trying to create off-campus access to on-campus resource, your technology department is scrambling, just as, all right, well, let's open up the firewall so anyone can access it. Well, don't create security holes in the interest of accessibility. Just do it right, follow the process. Even if you do temporarily open up access from the outside because you either don't understand how or it takes a little bit too much time, there's a risk that you forget to close it when the emergency is over. So I recommend you do it right the first time and don't change your security procedures or security plans You'll have to consider that people off campus have to have access to resources, and those resources that are on campus could include file servers, SIS, LMS, things that are hosted on servers on campus. The people that are working off campus still have to have access to them. And then another procedure that is new to be considered is that all of the school's staff and students are off campus. We don't design network systems typically for that eventuality, so there are going to be some things that can get stressed when everybody is trying to access on-campus systems from off campus. So make sure that your technology people know to monitor heartbeat, they monitor performance of all of the pathway of data from the internet into the on-campus system. Just some other things to be aware of in technology roadblocks is if you have cable modem or DSL as your primary method of internet connectivity, you're going to have a lot of problems. And you should really consider in those cases not relying on-campus resources being available, but instead look to all of the access you can make to off-campus and cloud-based resources. The last technology roadblock to consider is, and I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, is the difference between asynchronous and synchronous teaching, remote teaching. Synchronous is what we're all doing now, where there's a presenter and a lot of people are watching the presenter go through material. Maybe even with smaller groups, can be more participatory, where anybody can interrupt at any time with any questions. Those are always more complicated to set up. So we encourage asynchronous teaching in your remote teaching plans, if you haven't already developed them. Here are things to consider for the business office. Bring a laptop and a charger home every night. Everybody that's in the business office should do that. You should be prepared at any morning to check your email and see, yep, schools had to have been closed. And so whatever you have home is what you're stuck with until the emergency is over. Make sure that key people have a really good printer and scanner with plenty of paper and spare toner. You're going to go through a lot in an emergency, and so make sure you're loaded and ready to go. Scanner is a thing that most people don't think about, but you're going to have to sign documents, send them back. So a good, cheap, multifunction printer is, $225 at Amazon, and they can ship and still next day. So consider that. Your business office should have a secured stack of checks off campus. And if you have a 2-signature requirement, make sure that you've got your co-signature protocol down. I didn't want to write this here, but if a co-signature is required, you have to consider the eventuality that the 2 signers won't be able to meet. So how are you going to handle that? You want to create and export a key list of vendors with their account numbers, contact numbers, and that should include power company, internet providers, cell phone providers, rent if that's an issue, and water. And you can see when you see this list how essential it's going to be that you have to contact these people in some eventuality when you're forced to be off campus for a period of time. By the way, Chris, just to check in, level of detail too much, step up, or continue?
I think this is right on.
Okay. When you're now in the time where you have a little bit of breathing room for planning and preparation, when you're off campus, set up and test that you can access the school systems when you're off campus, access the on-campus school systems through a VPN. You'll want to test that today and make sure that, let's say you're at home, can you access your SIS, your accounting, accounts payable, accounts receivable, LMS, your development office. Many of these things are still hosted on site at some schools, so make sure that any service that you host on campus is identified and you know how to access it securely when you're off campus. And test those functions. Test report writing, which is sometimes a complication. Test that you can print checks. One idea that we gave to a school yesterday was that they sign up for eFax, which is a way to get a temporary fax number that goes to an email if you don't already have that. What you don't want to have happen is that critical documents, essential documents, are being sent to a fax machine in an office that has been empty for 2 weeks and maybe empty for another 2 weeks. Sign up for county health alerts and emergency alerts, just so leadership is aware of what the county is recommending. When there are schools, you're probably already in contact, so I won't go into that. Prepare for, as I mentioned before, each critical role should be duplicated, and come up with technical support protocols. How will people that are now accessing everything off campus and remote for the first time be able to get support when things invariably go a little sideways? And the other thing is just make sure you have a backup plan when you're unable to communicate. For example, if let's say that there's a CFO who's required to print checks, or a controller who's required to run payroll, and they've not responded to email or phone calls in 24 hours, time to think about what the backup plan is for initiating those processes. Don't presume that they'll get back online and those things will happen. Okay, this probably maybe a little bit more than what we need here. The same thing with teachers, just make sure they have a laptop and charger at home every night. They may have to start remote instruction, having never been able to get back to campus from the time it was closed. The key things for them to have access to: grading system, student information system, learning management system. Okay. And we'll talk about this a little bit, but here are some things that teachers will have to have prepared prior to converting to a remote instruction model. This is not by any means a complete list, things to consider. That lessons will have to be developed, the types of lessons, synchronous, asynchronous, live or semi-live participation, the lesson plans and the tools that are going to be used to deliver those lessons. What are the processes that teachers are going to use every day to check in with their administrators? It can't be nothing, so make sure that you think through how we're all checking in. We had one school yesterday that said, well, what we're going to do is when we're off campus, we're going to have a 7 a.m. Call between the head or the division leaders and all of their faculty, just so we can all touch base, find out what's working, what isn't working, what needs to change, and just provide a little bit of community support prior to each day of remote instruction. I thought that sounded like an excellent idea. And know how student attendance and participation will be kept. Maybe your attendance system supports saying, in addition to being present or not present, maybe there's something that says remote. That might be a thing to consider for your grading system, your attendance system rather. And again, like administrators, let teachers know how and when they can get technical support if they're having trouble connecting with students. It's going to be a real impediment if a teacher is unable to deliver the lesson. It may be a day that the school gets charged for that group of students not being present or not having been able to take their lesson. Okay. I'm not going to go over all of these things. You'll get it in the slide. But here are key things to think about in the communication plan that you should implement as quickly as possible today, over the weekend. One is to make sure your website has at least a page that addresses the response, and that you put a banner or a link to that page on your homepage. It is this page that should be the essential point that families, students, teachers, all of your constituents go to find out, what is the school doing? What's the status today? What are phone numbers that I need to use to contact? What happens in the event of an emergency? There are a lot of questions that will have to get answered on that page. Create it, start to create the link, and start to create content as quickly as you can. And this is another important thing, as we sometimes work with schools, that all of our schools have emergency notification systems like Blackboard Connect. There are a number of them. Just make sure you know how to use yours. Make sure that you have all of the latest student and parent contact information and teacher information as well in that list, and test it. One suggestion for a test would be to send a message that says, here's the link to our new COVID response plan on our website. And that can be the test. You can see How effective was it? How quick was it to get the message out? Who had trouble accessing the message? Now is the time to make sure you have time to resolve the problems that occur when you send the message. Another one that was provided earlier in the week, another idea, is that you create your key messages ahead of time and you wordsmith them. What happens when you close school? What happens when a community member has been in contact with someone with the virus? What happens when there's a community spread? What happens when the county closes the school? So think of what the key messages are and may as well create them now ahead of time to make sure you're not creating them when you're in a bit more of a panic. And then test it. Just make sure you know that system inside and out. And the last thing to think about from a communication preparedness standpoint is your phone system. Make sure you have access to it, that you can create a new outgoing message in the event of a closure. Sometimes in phone systems, we see that they're called holiday greetings. Unfortunately, it's a misnomer, but in this case, but it could be a holiday greeting, like we're closed for the Thanksgiving week, or we're closed for the holiday break. It would be that vein where you would now discuss that you're closed in response to the virus, and this is the latest information that we have. And then you should decide whether you want to or whether you don't want to allow voicemails to be put into that box when families call. Families, students, they're going to be very concerned and will have a variety of questions. And sometimes people aren't going to be as facile with a proactive email question or an email concern, and they're much more likely to leave a voice message. So if that's the case, maybe you think about supporting it, and maybe you charge somebody with daily or semi-daily reading those messages. So again, I'm thinking that I'm addressing, primarily business officers. You'll have to have a protocol for how you're tracking employees. You should probably have 2 people responsible for this, determine how frequently employees check in. And if you haven't heard, I'm envisioning a spreadsheet here. These are like different columns. The time and date of their last check-in, what is their status? These are just some ideas that you may or may not decide to collect. Where are they? Sometimes they may be at a different location, either with or away from family members. And then if you are trying to contact employees that have been out of contact, you might want to log how you're attempting to contact them. You may not think about these things now, but in an emergency, there should really be a central place for all employee contact when they're not in a building. The last topic I have is just instructional considerations. And I just want to do this for 5 minutes because I'm going to point you primarily to links. Schools obviously are going to, yep.
Tom, I just want to jump in for folks on the line. I know we're at 11 o'clock. We're going to keep going. As Tom said, probably another 5 or so minutes on the remote side, and then we'll kick into questions. So for folks that can stick with us, please do. If you've got a hard stop at 11, this recording will continue, and so you'll be able to chime in and hear the questions answered a little bit later on in the day. So sorry for that interruption, Tom.
Sure. Obviously, schools are going to have to continue instruction. It could be a week or 2, or if school closure could be a week or 2, or up to the summer. Your plans should not presume duration. There are 2 different kinds of instruction. There is synchronous, like what we're doing right now, and then there's asynchronous, where a teacher might post a lesson and then give the students time to research, do the work, do the writing, maybe do some collaboration in small groups, and then respond with the rubric for that piece of instruction. And so we are really suggesting that if you don't have your synchronous instruction systems already in place and working, it may be a little bit much to bite off at the moment, and think more about asynchronous instruction. There will be links to this at the end of this, so don't worry about if you're not able to digest all of it. Make sure your teachers know how they can get support with their devices and apps and tools. Students and families have to know when to check in, and teachers are going to have to keep records on instruction and attendance, perhaps even lesson material. And this is more, accreditation, validation that a school day has actually occurred, We're not providing advice. I think yesterday was a CAIS conference that indicated some protocols or standards to make sure you know what they are, but you're going to have teachers keep lessons. Here's some really brief instructional recommendation. Of course, you have to develop a distance learning plan. There are resources at the end of this I'll point you to. We are well aware that different ages have different needs. What works for 9 through 12 absolutely will not work for 2 through 5. Younger students won't have email. So how are they going to be able to get their lesson and communicate with a parent? Just make sure that with teachers, you let them know up front what is going to be required. I saw a school with a new remote learning plan, none of which had been implemented, and 10 tools available. And it just struck me as being way too much new technology to implement too soon. Just think about starting small, introduce new tools slowly, and focus more on how to keep the students engaged and in communication than an optimally delivered remote lesson if you don't already have that plan. We recommend when you're building these instructional plans that you create a distance learning toolkit that allows teachers to choose what they're going to use and gives them lots of resources they can learn from. One of our schools is going to create little 1-minute videos on each tool or using a part of each tool. You know, we're actually doing the same thing. So you can check our website. If there's an outage and over the next 4 weeks, we're going to be creating more and more remote learning bits of video, and just make sure, again, everyone knows how to get support for technology problems, because technology is going to be implementing the instruction or going to be facilitating the implementation of the instruction should there be an outage. This is, I think, the last slide. I'm not going to go over all of these here in the interest of time, but asynchronous learning is a concept. There's a white paper that Dr. Moss Pike with Knowing Technologies wrote on asynchronous learning. It's valuable, it's interesting. We've also created a Google slide with different distance learning resources. We have our own COVID-19 status and planning page that one person is working on all the time, putting in more and more content. And yesterday, Dr. Joy Lopez and Joanna Neby from Sacred Heart Schools in Atherton sent out, maybe you all saw this, a really deep 26-page treatise on how they are supporting teaching during a level 2 event. The document's excellent. It's well written. It's not written for a general audience as much as it is how their teachers are going to be supporting teaching, but it gives some really good ideas as you're flushing out your own thinking in that process. There's my only cartoon. So you don't want to think ahead, plan, but be flexible when reality hits. So that is it. So one other thing, Chris, and I know we're out of time, but we created this personal safety set of slides that will be included that we presented to our employees. We've presented to some of our client schools so that their staff know how to operate a technology environment safely, meaning how to contact, how to clean, how to provide support to somebody who walks in your office, et cetera. So that will also be included.
That's awesome. Thank you, Tom. I think, to the point of giving employees something to follow and a sort of framework to work within for how to interact with technology and whatnot. One of the things I would encourage everybody to think about is what are 2 or 3 activities that you can cause the community to do. People are afraid of inaction, and when people are afraid, one of the best things that we can possibly do is just give them something to do and allow them to feel like they're engaging in the process and engaging in the sort of response. And so for a lot of we give playing cards to kids during lockdown. And it's that sort of activity of how do we get people to engage in this and feel like they're contributing to making the community safer. And so there were some questions that came up around, should we put hand sanitizer stations in classrooms? And is it really necessary to not do handshakes and instead to do the fist bumps? And the answer is, yeah, all of those are great ideas to help sort of cause people to recognize that they're doing something different. And in doing that, that oftentimes just helps them bring down their own anxiety and in turn the anxiety for the community. And so I would encourage you to think about those types of activities. And again, it's things like putting a hand sanitizing station out, either in each classroom or in each hallway, or at least having a few more on campus. Encouraging people to interact differently with fist bump and elbow bump, et cetera. Things like that will go a long way to helping them feel like they're contributing. There were some other questions that came in that I also want to ask and answer. The first is from Arlita. I'm just going to kind of pop around there a bunch in here. The first is from Arlita, and it's sort of what's the likelihood of schools closing down in LAUSD? And I know the same question exists for any of the big districts. They'll all make the same decisions we're making. Well, that's not the way to say it. They'll all use the same criteria to make the decisions that we're using. So certainly it's a possibility. I was in a meeting with them earlier in the week, and they're like independent schools are and charter schools are. They're talking about it, they're thinking about it, but right now it's not imminent by any means. Another one was, can we require families to notify us if they're sharing a household with a COVID positive person, with somebody who has the virus? It's a good question. I think I'm going to add that to the legal questions. In particular, I think I'm going to add it to the legal questions. My instinct is probably, but I do want to ask them for some feedback. So we'll add that to that list of questions and try to include that in the follow-up this afternoon. Couple questions for you, Tom. Do you have a plan already created from a school that you could share? And I'll just ask that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think the link there has already been shared to Sacred Heart Schools plan. So I would start with that. The problem is just what you said earlier, that it's, a plan is objectives meeting culture, and what works for one school won't work for another. But I think that you should consider that these plans have to be made. There has to be a communication plan. That means intercommunication for all of the groups of constituents. There has to be a remote instruction plan, and there has to be a technology plan that includes support, services, that sort of thing. So, I mean, that's at least the inventory of plans that has to be made. As far as sharing one, I can't think of one that would apply even across our schools. I can't think of how one would apply to another.
That makes sense. Couple other questions here. There were 2 or 3 around if school is closed for students, does that mean it's also closed for staff? And I love that question because it sort of shows the level of thinking and detail that you're working toward. The answer is, if school's closed, it probably is closed for everyone. And I use that probably qualifier because each of the closures, each community would be potentially closed in a different way, meaning the public health department may set different expectations based on the level of perceived risk in that specific community. And based on that, there would be questions answered like, can we get together in groups of 3 to 5? Can we get together at a specific location? Can we go back to school, et cetera? So what I would encourage at this point is to plan that nobody comes to school. And as Tom was talking about, that could mean that we wake up in the morning and find out we're not going today, and that sort of is our new normal.
Also, one more consideration, if I can interrupt, is that if the students are kept away from school, they'll need parents there, and many of our teachers are parents of students, so they may not be able to.
Oh, good point. Yeah. So I'd encourage you to plan as if you can't get to campus at all, and then be pleasantly surprised if a few folks can get to campus. Lots of questions around slides and recordings. We absolutely will share the slides out with you. We will get them out today at some point, and we'll share the recording as well. A couple questions around practices around students who are sick. And so I'll talk a little bit about this. I think the first sort of flag is, if we're in a situation where we need to quarantine students, we don't need a special space. We don't need a hospital room, no expensive equipment, et cetera, et cetera. This is a contact-based virus. And so quarantine means getting a student in a room. A health office is just fine. Anywhere else on campus that is private and secure is fine. And what you really want is you want a door. And so you don't need to worry about air conditioning and heating units or anything like that. You just have the student sit there until a parent can get them and get them to the doctor. And so that would be for any student where there is a fever and they're displaying the other symptoms that your health office determines. Again, right now, there's no indication that coughing, sneezing, et cetera, would be enough, so long as they're kept in a space that's safe and I hate to use the term isolated, but where they're by themselves.
And be consistent. Again, I can't state that enough. You're going to have your criteria that is going to cause you to isolate somebody in the way that Chris said, but you have to apply those criteria consistently. So, and objectively, I would say. So, this is Martha. One other thing I wanted to mention is I was listening to Tom speak, and thank you so much, Tom. That was great. And Tom and Chris and I were talking before the call. A lot of the things that you need to address, you have addressed. You would have to address in some way, shape, or form in any business continuity plan, whether it be for a fire, an earthquake, or whatever. This is just a new twist that we have not had to deal with. But one of the things that we had learned from the wildfires and from the schools that were impacted and had school closures during that time is that the community aspect. So we are the primary community for our students. We are the primary community for many of our families. And how do we continue to maintain community contact during a time of uncertainty? That is a role that we really do play and that people need. So I would think about that too. And Chris sort of talked about that with the cards and, how are people involved? But aside from the learning and academic aspect of it, there's a community aspect. And how do we provide that if we are in fact off campus for weeks? So that's something I think is worth talking about in your planning groups at school.
Thanks, Martha. I think there are a couple other questions around logistics, and to reshare some of that, we are going to share a copy of the slides and a copy of the recording today. If you are on our email list and that's how you received the invitation to join this webinar, then you'll receive them that way. If you're not, you're welcome to go to our website, and so you can sign up for our blog is probably the easiest way, and then we'll push it out to you. And finally, you can also send me an email or put your email address in the chat box.
And Chris, can we also post the link on the Kalispell website?
Absolutely, yeah.
I have one nuts and bolts question. So we talked about hand sanitizers and hand sanitizing stations. I don't know how many of you have been to the grocery store recently, but there's no hand sanitizer. So Chris, what's the deal with shortages on supplies like this?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so I will tell you, I've been to several stores looking for hand sanitizer, and a lot of that is out. There's a store across the street from me that like anything that has to do with soap they're out of. Amazon actually still has stock of quite a bit. That's a good solution for some of us. David just posted an interesting idea. If your maintenance provider has a catalog or a sort of a way for you to order from them, they oftentimes will have some. And then the other option is SOS Products in the Los Angeles Valley area. They still have some supply available, and so they're a good option as well. I think by and large, trying to order from the bigger organizations is good. Uline is another one. It's U, like the letter, and then the word line, L-I-N-E. They have quite a bit of stock of those types of products. So certainly it may be waiting for things to be shipped to you. You may not be able to walk to the store and get it, but in the next couple of days, you should be able to get some of that supply.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So I think we'll stop there. I appreciate everybody sticking with us, but also recognize that we've gone quite a bit over time. We are working on our cadence and trying to figure out the best way to be of support to you. And so in closing, I think I'd ask you to drop a message in the chat panel on the way out or in the question panel and just say, would it be helpful to do a conversation like this again? Would a weekly or a monthly or a daily, what level of engagement would be valuable to you from this team and others? Please feel free to share that on the way out. Thank you to Tom and to Martha for coming together to deliver this content, and thank you to everybody on the call.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.